Hey, I'm Geeky Pastimes, and welcome to the second part of my introduction to the Halo lore. And this time we're going to be looking at the Flood and the Siege of Charum Hakkor. Now, if you didn't check it out, in the previous video I explained where the sort of Forerunners came from, why they killed their creators, and kind of what the situation was like at the beginning of the Halo story. Now we're going to look at the role that humanity and the prophets actually had in the sort of early part of what went wrong for the galaxy with the Forerunners and the Flood. So, humans and the Sanshium, who are the race that sort of became the prophets in the Halo games, the ones that you know as the prophets, were exploring the galaxy. And they shared a world to sort of cement their alliance because they were really peaceful at this time. Like, they weren't fighting each other or anything like that. And they shared this world, Charum Hakkor. Now, Charum Hakkor wasn't a normal planet. It was a world that was left over by the precursors, an artificial world that had this ridiculous technology on it. So it had like huge buildings, these huge sort of arches all around it, and really powerful armories and weapons that meant it was an incredibly safe world. And like I said, the humans in the Sanshium decided to share that world. Now, both races at that time were developing incredibly quickly and very, very peacefully, so their technology was coming on leaps and bounds, and while the Forerunners were sort of ridiculously far ahead of them, they sort of kept an eye on them and didn't necessarily trust them. But remember, the Forerunners believed in the mantle, and they believed that they were the sort of superior beings that had a responsibility to look after all of the other races. So they sort of kept an eye on what the others were doing, but didn't try to interfere too much. Now, humans discovered an ancient precursor spaceship at the edge of the galaxy. So the Forerunners had destroyed the precursors, but during that war, the precursors had experimented with different ways to try and survive the battle. One of these ways was to create the primordial, which we'll talk about in another episode. But another way was they found a way to sort of turn themselves into a kind of dust that could be stored in cylinders. And the idea was that then they would be able to regenerate from these kind of spores in order basically to get revenge on the Forerunners. They created this while they were fighting the Forerunners, while they knew what the Forerunners were trying to do. Unfortunately, this never worked. Like, while they were trying to create this, everything that came back from this dust was sort of incredibly violent and mindless, so it never really worked and it was abandoned. But the humans found some of this dust on a starship right out on the edge of the galaxy. Humans brought it back, and the humans in the Sanshium decided to sort of experiment with it to see what it could do, because these spores were really interesting. They found that it had absolutely no effect on humans or Sanshium, but it did have an effect on very simple animals. So they had a kind of animal that they were using as like a farm animal, a type of herbivore, and when it was used on those, they mutated slightly, and they actually started attacking other animals and even each other, which was really strange because they were herbivores, but they were sort of starting to eat meat. Now, over time, without the humans really realizing, this spread across their livestock incredibly quickly. And then the humans were eating the livestock, and it started getting into them. And through this, it started infecting humans. And once it started infecting humans, it could then infect Sanshium as well. And it started kind of taking them over and turning them into these sort of cannibals, these aggressive creatures. And although the individuals seemed to lack intelligence, they had a kind of hive intelligence. They seemed to be being controlled by something. And they started spreading across worlds incredibly quickly. They couldn't build their own ships. Like, the Flood don't build much, but they can control other things that they've kind of stolen. So the beings that have taken over, the humans that they've taken over, could still control ships. And so it started spreading across worlds. And this started a war between the humans and the Sanshium on one side and the Flood on the other. And the Flood were winning for quite a long time, because basically, if they weren't completely wiped out on a planet, if there was any of them left, even just a few spores, they would end up taking over all sentient life on that planet. And then they would sort of find ways to get off the planet and go to the next one and go to the next one. And this was sort of devastating the Alliance. So the Alliance decided to gather under this human leader called Forfencho. And he was a human who ended up sort of taking control over it. And he decided that the only way to stop the Flood, these Flood were, as I said, even a single spore could end up destroying an entire world over time. It was like the ultimate zombie outbreak. Bear in mind, they're not even just like normal zombies. They're like zombies that can also use guns and fly starships. Like, they are incredibly powerful. he decided to create a kind of firebreak of worlds. So to destroy all the worlds around the infected ones, thinking that the Flood wouldn't be able to fly that far. They didn't seem to be able to use slip space or anything like that. So by destroying some of the worlds around it, the Flood would be contained in that area of space, and then they could work out how to deal with it. But they just wanted to stop the spread. Now, unfortunately, some of those worlds they needed to destroy were Forerunner worlds, and the humans felt they needed to act quickly. So they just destroyed these worlds using some of the weapons that they'd found on Charum Hakkor. The Forerunners didn't know anything about this fight with the Flood. They didn't realise that the Flood were a thing. They didn't know the humans had been fighting against them and the Sandshim had been fighting against them. So all they saw was that a load of their worlds had suddenly been destroyed. Like they'd suddenly been wiped out of existence by the humans. And they saw this as like an unforgivable atrocity, which, makes sense. Lots of Forerunners died on those worlds. So the Forerunners decided to build a huge fleet to come and attack the humans and the Sandshim. They decided that, okay, this was something that needed to be stopped, this needed to be purged, so they decided to come and get revenge for their worlds. Now, the humans and the Sandshim were easily destroyed. They were already weakened from the Flood, and they were kind of doing something a little bit different with the Flood, which we'll talk about in a moment. But they were losing to the Forerunners at kind of every battle, and they ended up getting pushed back to the last few infected worlds, particularly Charum Hakkor, which was completely unprotected from the Flood, and also very, very easy to defend because it was so powerful. It had all of these weapons actually sort of built into the planet. The siege of Charum Hakkor, with the Forerunners' fleet attacking it, lasted for 3 years, and the humans, other than their defences on the planet, had basically been wiped out at that point. Like, humanity's armies had been destroyed, they had no way of threatening the Forerunners, all they could do was hold that planet. And the Sandshim ended up betraying the humans here. They decided that they wanted to survive, they didn't want to be purged in the same way as humans, so they made a deal with the Forerunners, giving them access to the planet, allowing them to sort of bypass the security, in exchange for becoming a sort of subservient race and being quarantined away from the Forerunners and obviously the Flood. So the Sandshim decided to save themselves and sort of threw humanity under the bus. So the Forerunners very, very easily then managed to get onto the planet, get onto Charum Hakkor, and force Forvencho to surrender. Now they found, when they got there, the Forerunners suddenly realised what the Flood had done and what had happened in the last few years. And they'd also found that the Flood had mysteriously gone, and they didn't understand why, and the humans didn't really explain why. I don't think the Forerunners gave them much of a chance. So the humans at some point in the war had managed to find a way to stop the Flood. And what had happened was the humans had found that they could control the sort of genetic code of the Flood and then change it to be a kind of different strain and infect humans with this sort of new strain. Then when the Flood took over these humans, so they'd leave the humans that had been infected with this new strain in the path of the Flood. When they got absorbed into the Flood hive, they actually started fighting against the Flood. And this caused a kind of civil war in the Flood that made the Flood essentially tear itself apart. Some of the uninfected Flood, some of the original Flood, realised what was going on and took one of the ships and went to the edge of the galaxy to protect themselves against this new strain, because it was incredibly hard to, work out which part of the Flood was infected and which wasn't. So they almost quarantined themselves off at the edge of the galaxy, so then they could wait until they could sort of come back at some point. But the Forerunners didn't know this. The Forerunners didn't know what the humans had done. So, while they were deciding what to do with humans, they weren't sure whether to exterminate all humans, but they felt that, because they had the mantle, they were the responsible beings in the universe or in the galaxy, that they should look after them. They decided to do something that they saw as kinder, and that was to devolve humans. So they took the humans and they basically regressed them back to a state where we didn't have any technology, we didn't have any language, and they sealed us off on Earth. So they took all ability we had to sort of travel through space, all knowledge we had of any kind of technology at all, and forced us back. So basically, back to sort of like the caveman times. That's, in the Halo lore, that's where we sort of got pushed back to. And when they were doing this, they decided to keep some humans, the ones who'd been fighting on Charum Hakkor, so Forvencho, the leader, and then a few others, and they decided to submit those to a composer, which was a strange device that the Forerunners had tried to create. And the idea behind it was that you could take something living and turn it into data turn it into just raw information, and this would be a way to kind of live forever. Unfortunately, it didn't really work, because whenever they tried to then put that data into something living again, it would turn into like a weird abomination. So instead of becoming something that would be like an elixir of life, it ended up becoming a punishment. So they subjected some of these humans, including a leader, to the composer, turning them just into pure data. And the idea was that they would be able to study them for years and work out how humans had cured the flood, because that's what they saw it as. They saw it as something where the humans must have found a cure to the flood, and they wanted to work out what that was. Now, the didact, who was the kind of forerunner military leader, his wife was the librarian. And the librarian had a different idea and decided to secretly take some of that information and send it down to the humans and integrate it with the devolved humans. So we would have some of those kind of memories in our genetic code, with the idea being that over time we would evolve again. And when we evolved, maybe we'd be in a position to work out how to beat the flood again if they were a problem in the future. So the librarian was hoping that we would evolve to a point where in the future we'd be able to ally with the Forerunners and protect them against the flood if the flood ever came back. They had no idea how to stop the flood. They saw what the flood had done to human and Sanshian worlds. They saw like the desperate lengths that the humans had gone to try and stop the flood, and they were terrified about what was going to happen if the flood ever came back. And so what they decided to do was create the Halo Array. And in the next episode, I'll talk about what the Halo Array was and what else the Forerunners did to try and stop future invasions of the flood. So thank you very much for watching. If you find this stuff interesting or useful, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments if you've got any questions or anything you want to know more about. And I'll see you ready for the next episode. Goodbye.